No, 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 you get out of here.
No, too much? Okay.
Violating my space. Okay, well, as I said before, you've been great. I appreciate the engagement a lot. I want to read a text to begin with. This is from Isaiah 58. I discovered this text, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago. It's really become one of my key texts. You know, we all go through different phases where we have a text that kind of emerges as central to how we understand our life in the world and our faith in Christ and so on. And this just popped out at me. And you'll see why. If you take away from the midst of you the yoke, the pointing of the finger, and speaking wickedness, if you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness and your gloom be as the noonday. And the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desire with good things, and make your bones strong. What a great line that is. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters fail not. And then this, and your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. Isaiah 58. All right. The most important meeting in world history, a unique God, a unique people, and now a unique culture. The 4th century, and I'm sure most of you know this, represents a turning point in the history of Christianity. And it wasn't the result, at least not entirely, of the conversion and patronage of Constantine either. He kind of gets a bad rap. We blame him a lot. I'm more interested in the bishops than I am in Constantine and how they responded. And they didn't all respond in the same way. We had the group that loved going to the White House, Eusebius of Caesarea, for example, who wrote the first history of the church and a biography of Constantine. He was, to say the least, laudatory. But there were other bishops who were not. An interesting observation, by the way, most of the great bishops of the 4th century, as we would define great today, spent time in the desert. The one exception is Ambrose. But most of the others, Basil, for example, Chrysostom, Augustine, all around the Mediterranean world, were mentored by desert fathers and in some cases mothers. In other words, they distanced themselves from empire. Probably developed a little thicker skin before they went back in and began to resume some kind of church office, and mostly against their will. In fact, some ran away. They didn't want to serve as bishops or as church leaders at all, and they were drafted into service almost against their will. In fact, John Chrysostom wrote a book about why he fled from being a bishop, and it was a book on pastoral care. He considered it such a high calling, he wanted to avoid it at all costs, but he became a bishop anyway. Well, in the 4th century, a new culture, religiously, materially, institutionally, and intellectually thick, emerged to compete with and eventually overtake Roman paganism. That culture was Christian. A contrast between two formidable figures from the 4th century illustrates the point. What's interesting about this case study, I love case studies, is that they most likely knew each other. They both studied in Athens at the same time, kind of their PhD work, if you will. And after they left Athens, they moved in very, very different directions. And they certainly knew of each other. The first was Julian the Apostate, Roman emperor from 361 to 363. He was related to Constantine, I think maybe a nephew or something like that. He grew up in a Christian home but rejected Christianity in early adulthood. He kept this to himself. It would have been highly risky for him to even announce that to anyone by this time. And he kept that to himself until he resumed the throne as emperor. Then he tried to use his imperial power to denigrate the Christian message, undermine the ministry of the church, and marginalize Christians. He became an opponent. He called Romans to return to traditional religion, which in his mind would help Rome recover its glory and its prosperity. Julian devoted himself to restoring the old religion. He was confident he could succeed, and that makes sense when you consider the resources at his disposal. He was, after all, the emperor of the Roman Empire. But try as he would, he discovered he could not motivate followers of traditional religion, nor the priests presiding over traditional religion, to live moral lives and to serve the poor. He complained that they would not live like Christians. It seems he wanted to hold pagans accountable to the same standards that Christians followed, and though not informed by their worldview. Mere restoration of the old rites and rituals, which had suffered from decades of neglect. You know, the old Roman pagan rituals, that was not enough to him. He wanted to see his priests behave like bishops. He couldn't convince them to do it. Now, we have him in print. In a letter to Arsacius, a high priest, he wrote, Arsacius, excuse me, it's hard to pronounce. Why then do we think that this is enough? Why do we not observe that it is their Christian benevolence to strangers, their care for the graves of the dead, and the, I love this, pretended holiness of their lives that have done most to increase atheism? Now, that's a strange word to use, but Roman pagans called Christians atheists because they didn't believe in the traditional gods. I believe that we ought really and truly to practice every one of the virtues that they exhibit. He admitted with frustration, for it is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans, that's Christians, support not only their own poor, but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us. By the way, he wrote a book against Christianity called The Galileans. So he was a full-fledged opponent of Christianity. He only died after he was in office for a couple of years. He was killed in battle, so we never know how this story would have turned out. But you can tell his deep frustration that he could not motivate his pagan religion to do good to others, too entwined in traditional Roman culture, which was a patron-client culture and cared nothing for the poor. There's a great scholarly literature on that, by the way, including Helen Rhee, who teaches at Westmont, who wrote a book on poverty in the Roman Empire. And Romans hated the poor. The second figure, familiar to you, is Basil of Caesarea, also known as Basil the Great, a contemporary of Julian's. He was born into a prominent Christian family, one of 10 children. Several members of that family, 6 as I recall, actually have become saints in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, including his sister Macrina and his brother Gregory of Nyssa. He enjoyed the privileges of growing up as a member of a prominent family, which means he received the best of education, first in Caesarea, then in Constantinople, and finally in the kind of capital of the intellectual world, Athens. He was a brilliant student, but also inclined toward conceit. And he was called on the carpet by, of all people, his older sister, Macrina. And he repented. He withdrew and went to the Egyptian desert to study under the Desert Fathers for a few years, which utterly transformed his life, as we will see. And then when he returned to Asia Minor, Cappadocia, it's right in the middle of now modern Turkey, he founded a monastery and wanted to live the monastic life. But his abilities and ambitions were just too great to be confined to the monastery. This was a driven man, kind of like a 1 or a 3 on the Enneagram scale. He was recruited as a lector in Caesarea, then ordained a priest, and finally elevated to the office of bishop in the year 370. In these various roles, he involved himself in all the important controversies of the day. He was a fierce opponent of Arianism, for example. He developed a strong bond with what became known as the Cappadocian Fathers, and they were a powerful force for good, theologically and in many other ways, during that last half of the 4th century. He didn't hesitate to make decisions. He was kind of bossy, very big personality, unlike his best friend Gregory of Nazianzus and his kid brother Gregory of Nyssa, and both of them resented him for it. I mean, it's kind of cute to read their correspondence and realize there is tension there because big brother likes to boss his friends and so on around. But he was also courageous. A high-ranking Roman official once wrote to Valens, an Arian emperor, "We have been worsted, sire, by the prelate of this church. He is superior to threats, invincible in arguments, uninfluenced by persuasion." Well, Basil was especially known for upholding the commitment to justice and to show mercy, especially on behalf of the poor. And this was new in the Roman world, not, of course, in the Christian movement. That predates it by centuries. As his biographer and friend Gregory of Nazianzus wrote, he committed himself to the support of the poor, the entertainment of strangers, hospitality, the care of maidens, that is, virgins and widows, legislation written and unwritten for the monastic life. And he finally, when he became bishop in 370, founded a community that turned into a city. And that city was named, to honor him, the Basileid. Scholars consider it the first Christian hospital in all of Western civilization. A contemporary of his, by the way, Fabiola, founded a similar one, not connected to that, in Rome, around, the late 4th century. It grew so big that it provided education, housing for immigrants, care for lepers, basically a nursing facility for aging people. I mean, it was an empire of service. When Nazianzus wrote his final tribute to Basil at his death, this is his best friend, he said that this had become so wonderful and so powerful that it exceeded all the wonders of the ancient world put together. Now, probably a rhetorical flourish, but you have to admit it must have been really, really impressive. Some of you live in Southern California. You ever heard of City of Hope? Is that still exist? Okay, that's sort of the same feel, but multiply it times about 100, and you'll get to the impact of the Basileid in this particular period. Now, this hospital of Basil's provides one example of the emergence of what I would call a Christian culture. That is to say, the values, the artistic endeavors, the social institutions, the intellectual framework, the coherent worldview of an identifiable group of people, in this case Christians. And it began to shape the entire Roman Empire. We see lots of visible signs of this in the 4th century, but it actually predates it by a couple of centuries, depending on what it was. Now, you have to realize, up until Constantine, Christians were operating at a severe disadvantage. They couldn't do a lot of institution building because Rome would have simply torn it down. So they had to do small-scale culture building during that time. One of the things you can always do is create a literary culture if you can't build buildings or paint big pictures or something like that. And we see signs of this literary culture everywhere in the first few centuries of Christianity. I mean, we could probably name authors right now here. We have great apologists like Justin or Athenagoras, or the one I read to you yesterday, the so-called Letter to Diognetus. We have massive collections of sermons that go back to Origen and Cyprian in the 3rd century. We can read those sermons today. It would be a great exercise in some of the reading groups I've led over the last 10, 15 years. We always read some ancient sermons. And in some cases, they read so contemporary. You think, are you kidding me? It's like they live in the same world that we do. So Chrysostom, for example, we have 800 of his sermons in print. Augustine, even more. And you can buy the Eastern Church Father Seminary sermons, by going to St. Vladimir Seminary Press. They have a lot of those in small volumes, 125, 150 pages. We have poets, Prudentius, who wrote massive poems in the 4th century. We actually sing a small section of a poem for a hymn. Let all mortal flesh keep silence. Some of you are at least familiar with that hymn. Ephraim the Syrian, for example. We have great liturgies like the Liturgy of St. James, and so on. So we see early signs of a literary culture. Christians also began to found academies, what we call schools of higher learning. But of course, back then they were very small scale, and they actually imitated how the Roman Empire developed those schools. So they would just do a kind of Christian alternative, like a Christian college or university would be today, and a Christian alternative to these pagan philosophical schools. Justin Martyr did that in Rome. We had one in Alexandria, but my favorite is the school that was founded by Origen, who died in 254. Now, he's had a spotty history in the whole history of Christianity because he did flirt with some pretty crazy ideas. But in the main, he was deeply orthodox. So I think we can give him a pass. He was also probably the most brilliant thinker that Christianity has produced to the 4th century. I mean, he was amazing. He wrote commentaries and all kinds of things, mystical theology, very productive scholar and thinker, very fresh and original, and sometimes borderline heretical. But here's why he's valuable. One of his students was a man by the name of Gregory of Thaumaturgus. Gregory was an adult convert and fell under the spell, the influence of Origen when he traveled. Actually, he was, I think, traveling to Caesarea Philippi for another reason and accidentally met this man and was so taken by him, he studied under him as a new Christian for 7 years, and then was dispatched to go to kind of northern Asia Minor, Turkey this day, and plant churches. And he was so powerful in his ministry as this kind of church planting bishop that he has the nickname Miracle Worker. Well, when he left that school after 7 years, he wrote a tribute to Origen. It is gorgeous. Every seminary student should read this tribute, and it's short, which is even better. And he talks about the kind of educator that Origen was that set him apart from philosophical schools. For one thing, he said, Origen did not hesitate to expose his students to a broad range of writings, and not ones that he agreed with. In other words, they read the pagan philosophers. Instead of being defensive or protective, he said, take on the text, read it, and then we'll discuss it, and I'm not going to tell you how to think about it. Origen believed, he wrote, that his students should be exposed with all other writings, to all other writings, neither preferring nor repudiating any one kind, whether it be philosophical discourse or not. So what that really is liberal education without propagandizing or brainwashing. But the other thing he did is that Origen did life with his students. He ate with them, shared life with them, maybe drank beer with them, or whatever the equivalent was back then. And Gregory said he exemplified what it was to become a serious follower of Jesus. His example was as significant as his brain was. And thus, like some spark lighting upon our inmost soul, love was kindled and burst into flame with us, a love at once to the Holy Word, the most lovely object of all, who attracts all. By the way, Holy Word is Jesus, not the Bible. The most lovely object of all, who attracts all irresistibly toward himself by his unutterable beauty, and to this man, Origen, his friend and his advocate. Now, all this began before Constantine came to the throne. As I've said to you before, Christianity created a kind of infrastructure of thought and practice and liturgy and discipline and relationships and ecclesiastical hierarchy and creeds. All of that was put together long before we had a Constantine on the throne. When Eusebius was paying ridiculously high praise to Constantine, he forgot about the 300 years that predated him and all the work that Christians did to set them up for Constantine's emergence and carry them after Constantine and the other emperors passed from the scene. They developed impressive resourcefulness and resilience that enabled them, as I've already said, not only to survive, but to thrive, and so became this third race or third way. What Christians did over a long period of time is create a kind of alternative culture. At first, liturgical and literary in practice, but then later on, when they gained greater numbers and power and wealth, it began to spread out from there and produce works of art and literature and so much more that I'll mention very briefly in just a minute, including communities of care. I'm going to quote a Yale historian, Wayne Meeks. He retired recently from Yale, and this is how he sums it up. Looked at from the perspective of cultural history, what changed was a broad range of sensibilities. There emerged altered convictions about the kinds of behavior that are fitting, right, and salutary for human flourishing. Example, you don't expose baby girls. How about that one? A new vocabulary appeared in talk about what ought to do and why. New senses of the end toward which a virtuous life would strive. New hopes and new fears, new institutions and sanctions came into being which undertook to direct the formation of the character of people and the movement. Now I'm going to quote someone from the 2nd century. 12 men, illiterate and unskilled in speaking, went out from Jerusalem into the world. Through the power of God, they revealed to the whole of humankind that they were sent by Christ to proclaim the word of God to everyone. Now we who once murdered one another not only refrain from all hatred of our enemies, but more than that, in order to avoid lying or deceiving or examining judges, we meet death cheerfully for confessing Christ. Justin Martyr, who, by the way, died as a martyr. All right, now I'm going to have to admit that the formation of this culture beginning in the 4th century did benefit from the patronage of Constantine and some later emperors. They grew in wealth, in visibility. Scholars estimate that in the year 300, there were maybe 5 million Christians in an empire of between 50 and 60 million. They estimate by the year 360, there were about 30 million Christians. No church can handle that kind of growth that fast. Well, we think in American culture we can, but we're wrong on that one. It happens to megachurches all the time until they crash land. And they began to seek imperial favor, some anyway, and they received it. Constantine began to favor them and other emperors after that. And over time, Christianity began to replace these pagan institutions. And it was the Christian teachers and so on who received more favor than the favor that pagan leaders and priests and intellectuals used to receive. But here's the question. What would happen to the Christian movement once privileged above its competition if the empire collapsed? And it did. All right, I'm going to give you about 1 minute of the catalog of ills that began to visit the Mediterranean world beginning around the year, well, before the year 400. Tribal invasions moved south. We know the names of them, right? The Franks, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians. My favorite is the Vandals, from which we get the word vandal. Some of them were just looking for warmer weather and wanted to cut trade deals with the Roman Empire. Others were more vicious and conquered and burned and pillaged. So it was a mixed bag. And Rome was simply overmatched after a while, until finally in the year 410, as you probably know, the Visigoths actually laid siege to Rome and conquered it, and pillaged it and burned it for 3 days. And that trouble continued for some time, until finally in the year 476, the last emperor to rule in the West was deposed until Charlemagne emerged as the, quote, Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800. Okay, so we've got that problem. Then, in 536, we had a natural disaster that no one understood the source of. A series of volcanic eruptions, probably from Iceland, were so severe that it literally encircled the globe with a layer of dust for over 1 year. And ironically, a massive comet struck in the middle of Australia, only exacerbating the problem. Records, by the way, from cultures around the world record this event. And now they've done research in the Greenland ice cap, and they can actually isolate the year 536 because it's all gray. Well, it set off a chain reaction of starvation. People thought it was the end of the world. They didn't see the sun for a year. I mean, it was truly apocalyptic. In 540, Justinian's plague came from the east and was probably smallpox, maybe the bubonic plague, but most scholars think smallpox, and wiped out over 10 million people. You want to live then? Really, I mean, it was just catastrophic. Then, 100 years later, a new religion emerges. And within 100 years, it conquers 2/3 of the Mediterranean world. Islam. 100 years after that, Viking invasions spilled down south in England. I mean, the Vikings actually reached, Sicily. I mean, they really penetrated many parts of Europe, and for the most part, they were pretty brutal. And as Rome began to falter and city sizes declined precipitously, what institution was prepared to fill that vacuum? It was the church. Honest to God, it was the church. By the way, to give you an idea of city sizes, the sizes of these major urban centers in the Roman world did not recover their population for 1,000 years. Rome's population in the year 300 was somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million. And by the year 500, it was less than 50,000. I mean, it was really horrible. I mean, when we talk about the Dark Ages, this is the Dark Ages. But the church did not make it the Dark Ages. It actually cast a lot of light. I'm going to mention just 3 institutions, in 1 minute, to give you an idea of how the church was poised to step in and put Western culture on its back. One was the sacramental system that made the Christian faith concrete and accessible to people who were suffering profoundly. And it wasn't just, Eucharist and baptism. It was a whole array of physical and spiritual objects and rituals and so on that infused the life of people. The sign of the cross. Later on, some rituals that people follow day by day. The calendar, the change of calendar, feasts and festivals. What happened is if people go through a year, the church was always there for them, inviting them to take advantage of the grace available through the church and its sacraments. And of course, they began to build buildings too, and that became the place that housed that sacramental life of the church. Now, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that was one of the ways the church carried Western culture for a long time. The second was the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the church. Now, we're long before we've got national churches, that sort of thing. You had deacons, deaconesses, exorcists, orders of virgins and widows, priests and bishops, archbishops, and so on and so forth. A whole array of offices that did the life of the church and provided services again for people. So the ecclesiastical hierarchy. But the most important by far was the monastery. Now, it began very small. There were some experiments in monastic living in the 4th century under the leadership of Pachomius, Basil of Caesarea, St. Augustine, John Cassian in what's now modern-day France. They all wrote rules. They all kind of came up with plans that somehow brought together ora et labora, prayer and work, and a rhythm of life in some kind of formal institutionalized setting. And these things gradually grew and multiplied. Now, you got to think about this as a centuries-long process, not 10 or 15 years. And I have an anecdote that actually has really had a big impact on my life. So the year after the pandemic struck here in the United States, well, around the whole world, I read an opinion piece in the New York Times, and the question in the opinion piece began with this: will 2021 go down as the worst year in world history? Well, I knew we've had a lot of bad years, so I thought that was pretty hyperbolic. But I got curious, and so on a whim, I Googled worst year in world history. And by golly, I got a date. Now, it's both serious and playful, because there's no way a historian can decide what the worst year in world history is. But that date was 536. I never could have guessed it. The date of the volcano and the comet exploding in Australia. Well, my church history hat I put on, I thought, okay, who was living in 536? And I had an aha moment. Benedict of Nursia. Now, Benedict grew up in an aristocratic home outside Rome, was sent to Rome to do his studies. Rome is in absolute collapse. He became profoundly disillusioned by life in what was once the jewel of the Roman Empire, and left, and borrowing from the playbook of the Desert Fathers, he withdraws into a cave and begins to practice the ascetic life and becomes a holy man. He attracts a following of disciples. He imposes a rule of life on them. It's not very clear. They turn on him and they try to poison him. He escapes, moves south to a place called Monte Cassino, and starts the experiment over again, and this time writes a short rule of life, so that when monks join him, they know what they're getting themselves into. He died in 547, so right during this period. And he left behind 12 monasteries of 12 monks each. So let's think about this as a church of 144 people. You're probably not going to be invited if you're a pastor of this church to speak at a big conference. But that little movement began to multiply. And monasteries became planted here and there and everywhere, until by the year 1100, you could not walk a day's walk anywhere in Europe and not run into a monastery. Some of the monasteries were as big as 800 monks, some as small as 15. There were thousands of them. And these monasteries literally put Western civilization on their back for 500 years. We don't have an institution in modern Western society that can function as a counterpart or example to what these institutions were in terms of dominating civilization. All right, let's think about it. They created a rule and rhythm of life. They became centers of unusual production. Wine, beer, furniture, wool. They became centers of agriculture and agricultural experimentation and animal husbandry. They were the libraries of the Middle Ages. They copied manuscripts, often in beautiful script, and illuminated them with design. Have you ever seen the Book of Kells? There's an example right there. It's gorgeous. They did that with hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts. And then they would put them in libraries, and they would study them. Do you realize that scholars are still discovering things in those monasteries that they didn't know were there for 1,500, 1,400 years? They recently found 12 Chrysostom sermons in a monastery in Russia that had disappeared from human memory for 1,200 years. It's just amazing. They became centers of education, first for the young monks when they moved to the monasteries, but also with local villages that grew up around them. They produced scholars. All the missionaries in the Middle Ages for 600 years were monks, all of them. They'd be dispatched. They'd go to some area where a tribe was ruling. They'd build a monastery. They'd learn the language. They'd establish trade relations and gradually begin to evangelize them. They won every tribe to Christianity except one over a 500-year period of time. They became the hospitals of the Middle Ages, the clinics, the pharmacies. They were like one-stop shopping in one place. Now, you think, okay, but not everyone was living in a monastery. They were the service agencies for all of civilization. And that's why even today when you go to monastic ruins, you find them in the middle of cities. They didn't plant monasteries in cities, the cities grew up around them. Now, eventually, in the Middle Ages, you start to see more division of labor. So first cathedral schools begin to crop up around the year 1100, and universities by around 1250. So that's a division of labor. Universities started doing the major educating. That would be a good example. Hospitals began to pop up. By the way, during the Crusades, the largest hospital in the world was in Jerusalem, and it was for pilgrims going to Jerusalem. It had, you ready for this? 1,000 beds with a medical staff. So, there's a lot there. And then, of course, they began to develop a literature in the High Middle Ages and art and architecture, culminating, of course, in the Gothic Cathedral, which is, I think, the first Christian building from top to bottom when it comes to symbols and that sort of thing. And hence we have what we call Christendom. a thoroughly Christianized culture. Now, let me qualify. That does not mean everyone was Christian. There's no way of knowing. And in a sense, it didn't matter. You're born into it. You're baptized into it. You're married into it. You're consecrated into it. You're forgiven by it. From birth to death, you just breathe Christianity, and then you're buried in it. I mean, it was so dominant, that was the only option you had in life. If you would have interviewed 1,000 people in the year 1100 or 1400 or 1600, 999 out of the 1,000 would have looked at Derek and said, I don't even understand your question. Are you a Christian or not? It doesn't even make any sense. And of course, it ran into all kinds of difficulties along the way, but we are profoundly indebted for the emergence of this Christian culture. Our university education, our hospital care, so many things that now have become far more secularized. In the city of Spokane, we have 3 hospitals, and guess what their names are? Holy Family, Sacred Heart, Deaconess, all founded by Christian groups. Whitworth, Gonzaga, far less Christian, of course, than Whitworth, no, but. So on the one hand, Christians used wealth, power, and privilege to do good and to build a good civilization. All you have to do is open up a book, read Dante, read Milton, read Pilgrim's Progress, read Augustine, and you feel like you're brushing up against Christian genius. Visit Notre Dame Cathedral. It's breathtaking. There's no language. You walk into that, and it overwhelms you with its, not just its beauty and its size, but there's something else. You feel like you're on the threshold, standing on the threshold of heaven, honestly. We also know the Christian movement abused that power, and we're having to live with the consequences of that to this day, too. Inquisitions, the abuse of gay people, gypsies, outsiders, the religious wars, the bloody, awful crusades, and of course the list goes on there too. But over the centuries, for many reasons I'm not going to cite, Christendom began slowly to decline and fade away. We're not living in that world anymore, although we have people who are still fighting for it. And I think there are 4 things that are happening currently that are reminding us, if anything, rubbing it in our face, that we are living in a very, very different period from Christendom. First, in America, social institutions are in a precipitous decline. Even if you don't see it in your own community, social scientists have taken this one on and documented it with massive research. Probably the best guy to read here is Robert Putnam. Now, he wrote Bowling Alone back in the 80s. That was his groundbreaking book. But his most recent gives about 10 times as much documentation. It's called Upswing. And when you read that book, you feel profoundly sobered by it. I'll ask a simple question that will illustrate. How many of you have Boy Scout troops at your church? Okay. Do you realize how unusual you are? Boy Scouts have declined dramatically in the last 30 years. It's a shell of what it used to be. Rotary Club, union organizations, union softball leagues, union bowling leagues. What we've replaced them with are niche clubs, climbing, biking, so on and so forth. And of course, the church has suffered from the same kind of decline over the past 40 years. So I would read that. I'd also read Timothy Carney. He wrote a book called Alienated America. He's another social scientist, and he's done work on the impact of the decline of churches in communities, and traces that when churches begin to decline, the community tends to go with it, especially in smaller towns. Second, as you well know, I'm not going to spend any time on this at all, the fastest growing religious group in America are the nuns. That's leveling off some, but I think it's counteracted by something else I'm going to mention in just a minute, so I'm not even going to talk about that one. It's outstripped all other religious groups. You know, social scientists divided up into this way: mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, Black Protestant, Roman Catholic, Jew, other, and nuns. Those 7 categories. Nuns are now the highest in American society. Third, again, I'm not going to spend time with this, is the emergence of the smartphone. You live with the consequences of that every day, not just with your teenager, but with you. It's been an obsessive addiction for all of us. It's killing us. It's literally rewiring our brains without us even knowing it. And now all kinds of data is coming out from higher education. And professors are saying students at places like Harvard and Yale don't know how to read anymore, largely because of the influence of the smartphone and its spillover. This last one I'll spend a little bit more time on. This is the 4th. The memory of Christendom continues to tempt the church to assert and protect Christianity's status as the privileged religion of America. Christendom runs so deep in our historical and sociological DNA, we want to fight to get it back. And we're willing to concede a great deal of ground to do it. So I was born in 1950, and I grew up in a mainline church, a downtown mainline church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was stunningly beautiful architecturally. I was wearing a sport coat by the time I was in the 5th grade. It was packed every Sunday. The ushers wore 3-piece suits with a boutonniere. The choir, 80 persons strong, all wore beautiful robes, and the women wore hats in choir. It was respectable cultural Christianity, and I don't mean that negatively. There were a lot of benefits. Although after we got done with worship, we'd go to the Penn Club for a nice lunch, and then maybe play golf in the afternoon. It was respectable, middle-class, white Christianity, and it was dominant in America. You know how precipitously that's trailed off. It's a shell of what it used to be. Many of our churches, First Pres is a good example in Spokane. When I was there, even at the beginning in 1989, we had 1,400 people in worship. We have less than 400 now. And I'm not blaming anyone. It just happened. Most of the big churches in downtown Spokane, Methodist, Congregational, and on it goes, have gorgeous buildings and nobody's there. But what happened is that the evangelical movement erupted about the same time mainline was just beginning to trail off a little bit. And I jumped on that ship in spades. I was converted, was discipled by somebody from university, went to Fuller Seminary when it was just popping with life and power and creativity. It was so fun, so creative. My youth group went from 25 to 150 in 2 years. And that was fairly typical in a lot of ways. Now, it's declining some, but it's profoundly fragmented. CT is not the house organ of the evangelical movement anymore. Gospel Coalition has got probably more readers than CT has. The thing feels like it's an iceberg out in the sea, and it's all breaking up. Highly politicized, often at war with itself. It's just profoundly sad to me. In my lifetime, I have witnessed the decline, maybe even the collapse, of 2 great religious traditions in America. We cannot reclaim Christendom. It's a fool's errand. And the more we try, especially by leveraging power or kissing up or accommodating our theology or whatever it is we do, we will simply speed up the process of secularization. I read this essay just a few weeks ago. And it's a guy reflecting a little bit. He's a retired professor. And so I'll just read it to you, this one short paragraph. He says that, I'll give you this preface, in the 90s, early 90s, he started reading Stanley Hauerwas and Will Willimon, all these Anabaptists, and thought, we got to be ready, America's secularizing, and we need to go back to the Sermon on the Mount and live like Anabaptists. The post-Christian society we've long anticipated has arrived, and in force. But its triumph isn't the result of the overt secularism espoused by Christianity's cultured despisers, reference to Schleiermacher there, who ultimately retained a great many more latent biblical convictions that even they probably realized. Think here, Tom Holland. No, post-Christianity marched right in the front door and did so in the name of a muscular, warlike Jesus ready to kick ass and take names. Most of us were prepared for a post-Christian society. Far fewer were ready for post-Christian Christianity and its untold and still unfolding tragedies. God help us all. Our job is to build a strong, healthy church. That's it. And out of that church are going to come a new generation of culture builders. It's probably going to take a generation or two or more. But that's the way of Jesus, not the way of woke or consumer Christianity or prosperity gospel or Trump Christianity. That's our opportunity. That's our charge. Final illustration. I know I've gone too long, but hey, here it is. Oh, you're shaking your head. Sorry, Noel. But after I lost my spouse, I used to take my kids on 2 vacations every summer. We go to Ashland for the Shakespeare Festival, and then we go to a national park. So one year we went to Yellowstone, and this was in the 90s, so my kids were pretty little. And about 10 years before that, there had been a terrible forest fire in Yellowstone that consumed 400,000 acres. It just torched parts of the park. And we were taking a hike one day to climb a peak of about 10,000 feet, and we had to walk through a stand that had been torched by that fire. It was an eerie experience because the bigger trees were still standing, but they were all dead, like gray ghosts, like tombstones. You know what that looks. No bark left, no leaves, a lot of limbs gone, and the rest of the limbs look like this kind of Medusa. And it felt like we were walking through a graveyard. And it felt depressing, like death was reigning, like it was dominating the landscape. But that's when we were looking up. But what happened when we looked down? Wildflowers and new bushes and new trees sprouting. It was this paradise of life, small but growing, feeding off the ash that was left behind. And I thought then, as I think today, that's my metaphor. I want to build in the ruins. And even if it's small, like it was for Benedict, when he left behind 144 monks, he had no idea that he was literally laying the groundwork for the renewal of Western civilization in the name of Jesus. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Thanks for your patience. Lunchtime. Thanks.
All right, friends, we have lunch happening right now. Please head over to the lunch area, and then we'll be back after that for dinner. Have a wonderful free time together. If you have any announcements you want to give at lunch, have strong lungs, because I don't think our microphones are working in there. So be ready to let us all know what's happening. Again, a reminder, there is that yellow pad in the back. You can sign if you are interested in Dr. Sittser's catechumen. And also, if you are a part of the board, we are also having lunch together. All of the board people will meet together at a table in the dining commons. Thank you.